alarm on my desk screen turned red before I had even finished my morning drink, and that color alone was enough to make my hands go still. My name is Thera Voss. I have served on the Interstellar Council for 140 cycles, and in all that time I had only seen that particular shade of red twice before. Both times it meant that something had gone terribly wrong between two species who were never supposed to meet in anger. I set my cup down and walked straight to the chamber, my robe still half-tied, because a courier drone does not interrupt a session unless the news cannot wait even one more hour. The grand chamber was nearly empty that morning. Most of my colleagues were dealing with a small trade dispute between two mining guilds, the kind of argument that fills a session with noise but never with meaning. I remember thinking, as I took my seat, that it would be a slow and forgettable day. Then the doors at the back of the chamber opened without warning, and a single courier drone floated in, alone, its light blinking that same red I had seen on my desk. The room fell quiet at once. Every head turned. The drone did not wait for permission to speak. It said that a Caldrexy raiding fleet had struck a human settlement on the border world called Calder's Reach. 6 ships had been sent. The strike was supposed to be simple, a fast raid against an undefended colony, the kind the Caldrexy had carried out 100 times before against smaller, weaker worlds. I felt a strange tightness in my chest as the drone continued. Humans were new to us. They had only been part of the wider galactic community for a short time, and every report we had ever filed on them said the same thing. Emerging species, low threat, monitor only. Their ships were considered barely adequate for defending their own systems, let alone fighting back against a trained raiding fleet. So when the drone said that only one of the 6 Caldrexy ships had returned, I thought at first that I had misheard it. I asked it to repeat the number. It repeated the number. 1 ship out of 6 made it home. The chamber did not gasp. Nobody cried out. We simply sat there in silence, the kind of silence that comes when a room full of experienced people realizes that everything they believe to be true might be wrong. The council called an emergency session within the hour. By the time I returned to my seat, 4 more of my colleagues had arrived, still wearing looks of disbelief. Among them was Doscaro Vey, an old officer who had overseen 3 border conflicts in his time and was rarely surprised by anything. He was the first to ask the question that everyone else was afraid to ask. He wanted the drone to play the full recording, not just the summary. He wanted to hear the exact words of the Caldrexy captain who had survived. The recording began to play, and the chamber grew even quieter than before. The captain's voice was shaking. He did not sound like a man reporting a victory, or even an ordinary defeat. He sounded like someone who had seen something he still could not fully explain. He said that when his ships arrived at the settlement, they expected no resistance. The colony had no military presence, no shielded bunkers, no trained defense force. It was, by every measure his fleet analysts had studied, an easy target. But the moment his ships opened fire on the outer buildings, something changed. The settlers did not run to shelters. They did not send out distress calls and wait for help. Every adult in that colony, and by human standards some who were barely past childhood, picked up whatever tool or vehicle they could find and moved toward the fight instead of away from it. He said that mining lasers, meant only for cutting through rock, were turned toward his ships within minutes. Farm equipment that had never been built for combat was redirected and used with a kind of desperate precision. One transport shuttle, carrying nothing but ordinary colonists, was steered directly into the shield generator of his lead vessel, disabling it long enough for the rest of the settlement's makeshift defenses to finish the job. He said the humans fought as if they had already decided they would not survive the day, and their only remaining goal was to make sure the attackers did not survive it either. When the recording ended, nobody in the chamber spoke for a long moment. I looked around at the faces of my colleagues, and every one of them wore the same expression. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of people forced to admit that a belief they had held for years was completely wrong. The Slith ambassador, a calm and steady woman I had known for decades, was the one who finally broke the silence. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. She said that our own analysts had rated the human fleet as one of the weakest in the region. She said their ships were considered defensive at best, built only to survive rather than to strike. And yet a group of untrained civilians, using tools meant for farming and mining, had destroyed 5 armed raiding vessels in a matter of hours. Doscaro Vey set his stylus down slowly, as if the weight of the moment had suddenly become too heavy to hold along with it. He said that for years the council had filed humans under a simple label, emerging, not yet a factor. He said it was becoming clear that we had filed them incorrectly, and that mistake might cost us more than we realized. The Caldrexy ambassador was summoned before the council later that same day. I watched him walk into the chamber, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to caution. He did not try to defend the attack. He said only that his fleet had made an error in navigation, that the coordinates given to the raiding ships were meant for an entirely different, unclaimed system. He said it was a mistake, a simple miscalculation of distance. Nobody in the chamber believed that explanation made the situation any better. A mistake that costs 5 ships and an unknown number of human lives is still a mistake with consequences, and everyone in that room understood that consequences were already in motion. Reports began arriving faster after that. Human patrol ships, small and previously considered insignificant, were now moving toward the Caldrexy border in numbers nobody had predicted. Their diplomatic channel remained calm and official, requesting only a formal explanation and a promise that such an error would never happen again. But calm words did not match what our long-range scans were showing. Additional human vessels, ships we did not even know existed in their current fleet inventory, were being moved into position along key routes near Caldrexy space. It was not a declaration of war. It was something quieter, and in some ways more concerning. It was a demonstration that they were paying very close attention now, and that whatever happened next would not catch them by surprise again. I spent that evening reading through every prior report the Council held on humanity. There were surveys on their culture, their trade habits, their diplomatic tendencies. Every single one ended with the same phrase, "Not yet a factor." I began to understand, sitting alone with those old files, that we had been measuring humans using the wrong scale entirely. Every other species in the Council calculates strength through numbers, fleet size, weapon range, population count. We calculate whether resistance makes sense before committing to it. Humans did not appear to run that same calculation, at least not in the way we understood it. When their home was threatened, the question they asked themselves was not whether resistance was likely to succeed. It seemed the only question that mattered to them was making sure whoever caused the harm understood exactly what they had started. That difference, small as it seemed on paper, changed everything about how dangerous they truly were. The next council session was far more crowded than the first. Word had spread quickly through every level of government, and ambassadors who rarely attended in person had come to hear the details themselves. The mood in the chamber was different now. There was less certainty in the room, and far more careful listening. A representative from the Farron Trade Council stood and asked a question that many of us had been avoiding. She asked whether this event had been an isolated case, a single unusual defense by a desperate colony, or whether it reflected something deeper about how humans as a whole might respond to threats. Doskarove answered before anyone else could. He said he had already requested older, unreviewed records from early human history, long before their arrival among the stars. He said those records were still being translated, but early summaries suggested a pattern that stretched back much further than one colony on one border world. He said humans had a long history of surprising more powerful forces who assumed an easy victory. He said it appeared again and again across their history, in different times, in different places, always following the same basic shape. An underestimated group faces an overwhelming force, and instead of surrendering, they adapt, improvise, and strike back with a determination that often changes the outcome entirely. The chamber grew quiet again as everyone considered what that pattern might mean for the wider galaxy now that humans were no longer isolated on their own world. I asked to speak next, and the council granted me the floor. I told them what I believed after reading through every file available to me. I said that we had made a serious error, not simply in the numbers we gave humanity's fleet, but in the way we understood their nature as a people. We had assumed that a young species, new to space travel, would behave the same way every other young species in our records had behaved. Cautious, slow to escalate, eager to avoid conflict wherever possible. Humans did not fit that shape. They were cautious in trade, they were slow to escalate in diplomacy, but when their homes were threatened directly, none of that caution applied anymore. The Slith ambassador asked what I believed should be done. I told her honestly that I did not know the full answer, but I believed the first step had to be complete honesty with the human government, and a clear explanation of how the attack had happened, along with real assurance that it would never happen again. She agreed, and by the end of that session, the council voted to send a formal delegation directly to human space, not through recorded messages or drone reports, but through a real conversation between representatives. I was chosen to be part of that delegation. The journey to human space took several days, and during that time I found myself unable to stop thinking about the recording from the surviving Caldrexy captain. I kept hearing his voice describing ordinary settlers turning farming tools into weapons within minutes of the attack beginning. I tried to imagine what kind of resolve it took to do that, to face trained raiders with nothing but equipment meant for peaceful work, and to succeed regardless. When we finally arrived at the human world nearest to Calder's reach, We were met by a small group of officials rather than a large ceremonial welcome. Their leader was a woman named Grace Whitfield, who introduced herself simply as a regional coordinator rather than using any grand title. She was calm, direct, and clearly exhausted, though she did her best not to show it. She led us to a quiet room rather than a formal hall, saying that after everything her people had been through in the past days, she preferred honest conversation over ceremony. I asked her directly how the settlers had managed to defend themselves so effectively against a trained raiding force. She was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that when word of the attack reached the settlement's early warning system, there had been no time to call for outside help. The nearest patrol ship was hours away. The colonists understood immediately that whatever happened next would be entirely up to them. She said that fear was there, of course, but so was something else, something she found difficult to put into simple words. She said that when people know they truly have nowhere left to retreat, something in them shifts. They stop asking whether they can win, and start asking only how much they are willing to give in order to protect what matters to them. She told me that many of the settlers who fought that day were not soldiers. They were engineers, farmers, teachers, people who had never expected to face a raiding fleet in their lifetime. But when the moment came, they did not hesitate, because hesitation was not a choice that felt available to them. I asked her what she believed the council should understand about her people moving forward. She thought carefully before answering. She said that humans did not seek conflict and preferred peaceful cooperation whenever it was possible, but she said we should never assume that peaceful preference meant an inability to respond with full strength when it became necessary. She said that mistake had already cost the Caldrexy 5 ships, and she hoped, for everyone's sake, that no other species in the wider galaxy would need to learn that lesson the same way. Her words stayed with me long after our meeting ended. As our delegation prepared to return, I found myself looking out at the quiet human settlement rebuilding itself in the distance, ordinary people continuing their lives after facing something none of them had trained for. On the journey home, I began drafting my closing report for the council. I wrote that for over a century we had placed humanity into a simple, comfortable category. Emerging, harmless, not yet a factor. I wrote that this label had been convenient, but it had never been accurate, and continuing to use it would be a mistake far more dangerous than the one the Caldrexy fleet had already made. I recommended that every species within council space reconsider how they approached humanity, not with fear, but with proper respect and careful understanding. I wrote that humans valued peace, cooperation, and fair dealing, and that any species willing to meet them with honesty would likely find a strong and loyal partner in return. But I also wrote as clearly as I could that any species who mistook their preference for peace as a sign of weakness would learn, as the Caldrexy had learned, that such an assumption could carry a heavy cost. When my report was finally read before the full council, the chamber remained silent for a long moment afterward, the same kind of silence that had filled the room on that very first morning when the red alert had appeared on my screen. Doskar Ove was the one who finally spoke. He said simply that the council would take the recommendation seriously, and that starting immediately, all future reports concerning humanity would be reviewed personally, rather than filed away under old assumptions. I returned to my quarters that evening feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. The immediate crisis had passed. The Caldrexy government had issued a formal apology along with reparations for the settlement, and tensions along the border had begun to ease. But I could not stop thinking about what Grace Whitfield had told me, about how ordinary people, facing an impossible situation, had chosen to stand and fight rather than retreat. I understood then that the true lesson of that single report was not about weapons, or fleet numbers, or battle tactics. It was about resolve, the kind that cannot be measured on any chart or file, the kind that only reveals itself the moment everything else is at stake. And I knew, as I closed my notes that night, that no species in the wider galaxy would ever again make the mistake of underestimating humanity, without paying a very real price for it.